In July of 2005, the ABC Daycare in Mexico was inspected by Jose Verdugo Ibarra, an independent architect hired by the Mexican Social Security Institute. In his report, the man pointed out that the building did not meet the necessary requirements to ensure the safety of the people inside. And that's because he had found a series of irregularities that prevented the establishment from continuing to operate. But he ignored it, disregarding and ignoring all the warnings about the consequences. He ended up working as usual. It was not something abnormal. Only a handful of the dozens of nurseries under the management of the Mexican Social Security Institute complied with safety measures at that time. It happened that instead of ensuring the well-being of boys and girls, the current policies for the outsourcing of childcare centers focused on cutting operational costs, a strategy that greatly benefited the owners. What were these benefits? Simply the additional profits. It was also common to observe a worrying situation. Many of the nurseries were overcrowded, admitting more children than they were legally authorized to. But this didn't seem to bother the majority of these establishments in the slightest, and the ABC Daycare was no exception. Even though they were only authorized to take care of 196 children, they housed about 220 children, who, a few years later, would pay the consequences of the corruption and negligence of adults in a scenario worthy of hell. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. How did the fire at this daycare happen? Why, to this day, many of the families of the victims are still claiming. Who were the heroes of this tragedy? Is it true that one of these heroes was cruelly forgotten? Answering all these questions will take us to June 5th of 2009. Un biman into asinde asiwan mas. The day the ABC Daycare Center caught fire. The Mexican Social Security Institute, commonly known as Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social, provided a wide range of services to formally employed and affiliated individuals. These included medical care, hospitalization, retirement pensions, and of course, something of great importance for working mothers: daycare centers for children's care. The Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social managed two types of daycare centers: the conventional ones, managed directly by this entity, and the subcontracted ones, which, since the modality started in 1993, were operated by private entities under contracts with the Institute. But a decade later, in 2003, a modification to the general law of the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social began to complicate things. And it is that the conditions to establish childcare centers were considerably relaxed. In addition, the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social reduced the investment it made for each child. This resulted in the saturation of nurseries, deteriorating the quality of childcare and resulting in a smaller amount of staff available to attend not only the needs of infants but also general tasks. By the year 2009, the nurseries under the management of the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social were operating in a state of complete chaos, especially in contract management, operations, and supervision. At that time, it had a total of 134 conventional nurseries and 500 in a subrogation model. Of these, only 14 complied with the regulations to the letter. Half didn't even have the current Civil Protection Constant, that is, the official certificate that ensures that a facility successfully passed a series of inspections. These inspections are intended to ensure that a facility meets safety requirements to protect people and property in case of emergency or disaster. As if this were not enough, many did not even have the approval of the local fire department. The situation worsened when considering another significant fact. The safety and well-being of 223,000 children were in the hands of the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social. Unfortunately, this unsustainable situation would soon lead to a tragedy. The ABC Daycare was located in Hermosillo, Sonora, and shared a building with a file warehouse, belonging to the Department of Vehicle Control of the Ministry of Finance of the Government of the State of Sonora. To be more specific, the place contained 5 tons of documents, vehicle plates, and 3 vehicles. On June 5th of 2009, while the children were napping, the warehouse workers went to eat past 2:30 in the afternoon without imagining the hell that would break loose half an hour later. At 3 o'clock, a fire started in the warehouse and quickly spread to all corners, eventually reaching the daycare. 176 children and 50 adults working at the place quickly found themselves trapped in a nightmarish scenario. The flames and black smoke enveloped everything in their path, and as if the fire wasn't terrifying enough, the polystyrene from the ceiling melted, causing toxic fumes to flood the environment. Outside the place, the dense column of black smoke immediately alerted those who were nearby. By the dozens, neighbors from the houses and businesses quickly approached in desperation, followed by rescuers, paramedics, and police arriving at the hellish scene. However, another grave issue compounded the already challenging circumstances. Difficult situation. The daycare did not have emergency exits, and the doors it had only opened inward. This not only made evacuation difficult, but also prevented neighbors and professionals from entering. The children and staff at the place were trapped inside at the mercy of the devastating flames. By this point, several of the parents began to arrive at the scene, uttering cries of anguish and horror. They were witnessing the most terrifying moment of their lives. Fortunately, in addition to the distressed parents, some of the most unexpected heroes also made their presence known. When Juan López Trujillo appeared, who everyone used to see walking the streets looking for materials to recycle, and knew as El Cayetano, they could not imagine that he would have to take action in the disaster. But the man, upon noticing that the police were immobile, did not hesitate for a second. With no protection, rescue knowledge, or equipment besides a fire extinguisher, he ventured into the fire. Dodging the pieces of ceiling that were falling charred to the floor and inhaling the toxic smoke, he began to traverse the hell that the facilities had become, and the first thing he observed at the back of the nursery was a motionless silhouette sitting on a chair. At first he thought it was a doll, but a voice in his head urged him to ignore that thought and approach to try to get her out. As he took her by the waist, the silhouette slipped from him and fell to the floor. The smell of burnt flesh gave him all the confirmation he needed. It wasn't a plastic doll, but a real girl. Wrapping her in his t-shirt, he started the return until he managed to find a single exit, almost impossible to visualize because of the smoke. Once outside, the police, far from warning him to stay away, as happened in the movies, gave him one of their uniforms and encouraged him to go back in. Many of the firefighters didn't know what to do, and some even fainted. But Cayetano ventured back in without hesitation, rescuing 2 more children on his second trip out of hell. The daycare staff meanwhile also helped with attempts to get the infants out. The confusion escalated when, amidst the widespread chaos, a van began to crash into the building. Indeed, Francisco López Villascusa and his father, Héctor Manuel López, had an unusual, dangerous, but ultimately effective idea to make holes in the walls this way. Through the holes they created, they began to rescue more children, although this maneuver complicated things on another front. The sudden influx of air fueled the flames and made the rescue task that Cayetano was still committed to even more difficult. Even so, he achieved a feat worthy of admiration by rescuing a total of 8 children from the flames. Unfortunately, many others were not as lucky and the consequences were devastating. And that's how our story comes back to the beginning. During the fire and after it, the children's parents were assisted and comforted. Not only by medical staff, but also by neighbors in the area who opened their doors to help them communicate with relatives. And it wasn't the only involvement they had. They also made their private cars available to help transport the rescued children to the hospitals, who were so many that they did not fit in the patrol cars. The police, the firefighters, the ambulance staff, and the Red Cross provided first aid and took care of assisting the victims, with resuscitation and oxygen equipment and cardiopulmonary resuscitation maneuvers. The scene, after the flames were extinguished, went from being the living image of hell to resembling a war zone. The building, demolished in parts from which people were entering and exiting in complete desperation, seemed to have been bombed. Ernesto Gandara, the then mayor of Hermosillo, arrived at the site an hour after the fire and publicly expressed his sorrow for his father. The then president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, expressed his condolences within a few hours, stating that as a Mexican, as a family man, and as president of the republic, He was truly saddened and dismayed from the moment he learned of the tragedy. Finally, the most chilling numbers were revealed. 49 children died and another 106 were injured, all between 5 months and 5 years of age. Most died of suffocation as a result of the materials with which the warehouse had been built, and of course due to the lack of fire extinguishers, smoke detectors, and emergency exits. About 70 surviving minors were hospitalized with serious injuries, along with 5 adults. In addition, 26 children received treatments for poisoning and approximately 30 were urgently transferred to the United States to receive specialized care for severe burns. Many of the victims, although fortunate to have survived, received harsh news. They would face consequences that would require long-term treatments and in some cases even for life. Over the course of that day and during the next, the funerals of the little victims were held in an atmosphere of absolute desolation. By June 9th, the daycare owners held a press conference in which they claimed to be unaware that it was at risk. In addition, they assured that the investments made together with other partners were the result of a legitimate interest. But someone had to take responsibility for the incident. Unfortunately, this would cost more than imagined. The coordinators were dismissed from their positions a few days after the tragedy. And the delegate of nurseries, the state delegate of the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social, and the head delegate of economic and social benefits. In August 2009, at the request of the victims' parents, Mexico's Supreme Court of Justice started an independent investigation into the case. The report revealed something that surprised no one. There was widespread disorder in the contracting session of private daycare centers by the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social and in the supervision of civil protection in these spaces. The first expert opinion had so far yielded a conclusion. The fire had been caused by the overheating of a cooling system in the warehouse. When the engine melted, pieces of flaming metal fell onto the archive documents and caused a widespread fire that spread to the nursery. But in the year 2010, a second expert opinion assured that there were no signs of electrical activity as the cause of the fire. The evidence that was found led to a chilling hypothesis. The fire could have been intentionally started in the file boxes stored in the warehouse. For what purpose? The answer is even more terrifying: to get rid of allegedly incriminating state documents. That same year, June 5th was declared National Day of Mourning. And later, the full court of the Supreme Court of Justice determined that the principle of the child's best interest and the rights to life protection, physical integrity, social security, and health were violated. Due to the fire, the Attorney General's office initiated a criminal process in 2015 against 22 people, including officials from the 3 levels of government and private individuals. Over the years, the number of defendants was reduced to 13 for the crimes of negligent homicide, negligent injury, and omission of responsibilities. In the year 2020, a decree guaranteed medical attention to all the victims of the fire who suffered injuries, which covered approximately 180 people. In addition, they guaranteed a lifetime pension to the affected minors who had disabling injuries and to the mothers of those who died in the tragedy. Although the reality ended up being very different. To this day, the now teenage victims continue to protest. The authorities do not recognize all of them as exposed patients and refuse to meet their needs. For this reason, 15 families are in a legal battle with the Mexican state, so that their children are recognized as affected by the fire and are provided with the corresponding medical attention. And the fact is that many of the young people require specialized treatment. The survivors suffer from lung problems, heart diseases, and all kinds of physical sequelae as a result of the inhaled smoke, in addition to severe cases of post-traumatic stress disorder. While most do not clearly remember the events, many become nervous and suffer from anxiety attacks when they see fire or smell smoke. It's not the sole call for justice that resonates. Currently, of the 10 people sentenced, none are serving their sentence. All remain free, some even suspected of having left the country. Despite the insistent requests of some parents of the deceased children, no entity agreed to bring the co-owners of the ABC Daycare to trial. Among them were not only relatives of members of Eduardo Borges' cabinet, who was the governor of Sonora during the tragedy, but also of Margarita Zavala, who at that time held the position of First Lady. Hundreds of people, including survivors, parents of the victims, and citizens, continue to march in large numbers every June 5th in Hermosillo and Mexico City to demand justice, shouting slogans like ABC Never Again Justice, ABC You Are Not Alone, and June 5th, neither forgiveness nor forgetfulness. In addition, relatives of the deceased children have formed various organizations from which they have carried out symbolic trials against people and officials they consider responsible for the tragedy, accusing the state of being guilty of the catastrophe and primarily holding responsible the then President Felipe Calderón for implementing a subcontracting scheme of Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social daycares in the country, without guaranteeing safety conditions in each of them. As a result of the activism of the victims' parents and various citizen organizations, the General Law of Service Provision for Care, Attention, and Comprehensive Child Development, which regulates the operation of daycares at a national level, it was deeply modified and came to be called the June 5th Law, although it was not effectively implemented throughout the entire country. All the victims continue to receive promises that seem like they will never be fulfilled. The same thing happened to one of the heroes. Francisco Lopez and his father, Hector Manuel, who made the holes by crashing their van, were given a new vehicle and were showered with thanks in the media. Cayetano had a very different story. After his heroic intervention, the man walked the 4 blocks back to his home and cried for several hours. Later, exhausted and without strength, he slept for 3 straight days. But his case was quickly publicized, and with it came the promises from the media and television programs, promises that no one would take care of fulfilling. He was taken to present his story to programs that assured him tours of Mexico City and even helped to operate on a hernia that prevented him from working. The surgeon Enrique Colonna guaranteed him live that he would operate on him for free, because in his words it was the least he could do for such important people who were the type of people that Mexico needed at that time. Apparently even less could be done, because once the program was over, Cayetano was sent back to his home and no one ever contacted him again. That being said, the municipal police always kept him in mind. Cayetano even ended up being brutally beaten by the officers just for collecting recyclable materials from the streets to survive. But stories like the one about the children he rescued from the tragic 2019 fire would never forget him. 10 years after the tragedy, one of the survivors reunited with her hero. Alexia Ortiz visited the man and they embraced, both breaking down in tears. She emotionally expressed that it had been a long time since she felt something like what she felt when she heard his heart next to hers, as she was once again in the arms that one day saved her from the fire. She also took him out to eat and for a walk and gave him a box of gifts adorned with a card that read, "For Cayetano, the hero who saved my life, thank you for existing." Later, she posted a photo with the man on her social networks and tried to vindicate him through the following words. "I introduce you to Cayetano, an anonymous hero who nobody congratulated, nobody looked for, and nobody knew more about him because he is from the neighborhood, but he is a man worth his weight in gold. God bless your life." Cayetano never sought great recognition. On one occasion, when asked what he expected for having saved the children, he replied that all he wanted was for God to set aside a little corner in heaven for him when he took him up, adding a sad but moving, "I'm kind of ignorant and I don't even understand what it means to be a hero." He also assured that the only thing he regretted was not having had more strength to be able to rescue more infants. But despite the courage and nobility of some, there is an undeniable reality behind the ABC daycare fire, which shows the other side of reality. It was a devastating consequence of negligence and corruption. Even worse, there's no one clearly responsible for this event. Impunity continues to reign, and no one is serving any effective sentence, as one of the survivors stated. 15 years ago, 49 families were left with empty arms, with torn souls, and with an absence that still hurts to this day. That's why, besides demanding justice, we must fight to ensure this tragedy is not forgotten. It is our responsibility to remember it and learn from it so that such a devastating event never happens again, neither in Mexico nor anywhere else in the world.